So I'm not planning to do a big kind of what is human. So actually, don't start with what you're not going to do. What are we going to do? So thanks for coming to spend this hour with us, folks. So what I was thinking would be an interesting thing to do today is just to have a conversation amongst us about what are the questions that arise for people when thinking about adopting a human learning systems approach. And just as a kind of 2-minute background to that, most of you will know that I kind of came into this space because I had been working for 15 years in the UK in the different bits of the public and voluntary sector at kind of local levels in the Northeast, regional levels, and occasionally at national government level. What that gave me was a deep and abiding frustration for how funding and performance management in the public and voluntary sector worked, because it just basically didn't. Funding and performance management got in the way of actual performance, and particularly the kind of outcome-based performance management regimes created an environment where no one told the truth to each other, as far as I could tell. And so set upon a journey to see whether we could do something differently. And so 6 years into that journey now, we've been able to work with a whole range of amazing organizations to actually now properly articulate what an alternative public management approach looks like. And a few years back, we started to call that approach human learning systems. So not going to do a big presentation on what human learning systems is, because I'm guessing almost all of you have a pretty decent understanding of that. And we did a big presentation. I did a big presentation on this not just a couple of months ago. What I'm going to do is just say exactly what the 3 core ideas are, and then I'm going to invite you all to ask questions, and then, as Andy says, we'll prioritize those questions, and I'll just discuss them as a group. So, core ideas of human learning systems. The fundamental beliefs of human learning systems are articulated by this idea of human. So we think that the purpose of public service is to promote human freedom and flourishing. And what it means to see a human being in public service terms is to understand that person in the complex web of relationships that is their lives. So seeing each person's life as a complex system. And so this is a kind of radically interdependent view of human beings. Those beliefs have consequences. So the belief that purpose of public service is to promote human freedom and flourishing has the consequence that only we have the right to determine outcomes in our lives, with the caveat about capacity and children and all that kind of stuff. But as a principle, like if public service is serving me, only I have the right to determine what a good outcome looks like. And secondly, that when we're trying to create positive outcomes, they are created by all the actors and factors in my life. So all the people, all the organizations, all the structural factors around me, that is what comes together to create an outcome. That means that human public service has kind of 3 components. It talks about the moral purpose of public service. It says that public service starts from the reality of the complex life of each and every person, and that is a unique set of circumstances for each and every person, and therefore that public service it demands that public service is built on strong relationships that enable a bespoke by design response. So if we want to create outcomes in each person's life, there is no alternative but to understand the unique context of each and every person's life and respond to that in a personalized, appropriate way. So human learning, that if we believe that again, that has necessary consequences for what management strategy for public service is. So if we believe all that to be true, learning is the management strategy for public service. And what we found was that people at all levels of public service, from those working directly with the public through to national government, are operating this kind of learning cycle. So they seek people to understand the system that they're operating in, co-design experiments and explorations to try, and then embed the results of those experiments in that system. And the systems element is about how all of those systems function together at different system scales. So one of the things we found from doing this thing is it's all systems. A person's life is a complex system. An organization is a complex system. The place is a complex system, and the country and region is a complex system. And what we found is that people are operating these learning cycles at all of those scales. And what's happening is that they're creating then connections, relationships between the learning cycles at different scales, where the job of the larger scale is to learn from and enable this learning cycle at the smaller scale. So the job of, if you think that this is an organization and this is a person's life system, the job of the learning the cycle at this scale is to learn from all the learning cycles at the scale below, and to experiment with ways to enable those learning cycles to happen properly. So what we've seen created then is a kind of a learning stack of learning cycles at all of those different scales, but rooted in the idea that the purpose of this is to create learning relationships between people who do public service and those they serve. And everything above that, the purpose is, how do you enable those learning cycles to happen better? And what can we learn from the learning cycles at the scale below? That is the entire purpose of management. So if that's the lightning version of human learning systems, what questions would you like us to explore together about how all that gets translated into practice? And now I will flip over to Andy to enable us to collect those questions and prioritize them.
Thanks, Toby. That's great. Okay, folks, so this is where the tech may defeat us, but we're going to try using Mural just to capture and prioritize your questions. If you've not used Mural before, it's very simple. It's just a web-based whiteboard. So I'm putting a link in the chat box just now. There we go. If I can invite you to click that link, and it should take you into the whiteboard. You shouldn't need to sign in or anything. When you're on the whiteboard, simply double clicking will create a virtual post-it, and you can just type your question in. So if I can ask you, if you've got multiple questions, just add multiple post-its, and as they arrive on there, I'll try and put them into themes, and then we'll do a little bit of voting on them. If anyone can't access the whiteboard, please just chuck your question into the chat box and I'll add it as a post-it into Mural for you. And if that isn't clear or any issues, just come off mute and let me know and I'll try and help. I think I've just got my Odin back on John there, because you're now titled Visiting Rhino, John. So that'll teach you for sharing photos of me. Not that I'm rhinoist, of course. So we'll just give it a couple of minutes to make sure we've got the key questions in there.
Andy, I don't know if anyone else is having a problem here, but I can't get anything to appear on the screen. It's just completely grey, and it's not responding to double clicking with a mouse. Is there a simple thing I can do?
Sometimes internet connection and other things can play havoc with Mural. So can I suggest that, Robin, if you've got questions, do you want to put them into the chat box for me and I'll paste them into the board for you?
Okay, I'll be interested to see what other people are posting so I can maybe contribute, but I'll try that.
Yeah, I'll try and do a bit of reading out to you when we've got them organized as well, Robin. Okay, so I'm just going to say 30 seconds more on capturing these, and then we'll try and organize our discussion.
I'll grab that question about children's services, Andy.
Thank you, Brill. Okay, folks, I'm going to ask you to hit pause there so that I can try and organize these. Toby, while I do that, if you want to just sort of make any commentary on ones that you're spotting there that might be useful to dip into.
Yeah, so I saw a number of questions that around the theme, how do you start? So maybe that, whilst you do a bit of organization, we'll pick up that question first, because I've already seen kind of two or three about that. So is that a kind of sensible way to go?
I think that's good, yes. So why don't I go on mute, do a bit of organizing, you can all have a discussion about how do you start, and then, yeah, and then I'll be back with you.
Great. And then so we'll have a conversation about how we start, and then people can kind of vote and prioritize on other questions. So I would emphasize that this is the way that you'll see through this, that I kind of see the world through a particular lens. And because essentially what we're talking about here is creating a paradigm shift in how public management is done. And so the theory of change that I work to around this is about how do you create paradigm shift. And paradigm shift starts with dissonance. So a paradigm is a kind of grand organizing story for any kind of discipline in the world, right? And we have a grand organizing story for how you're supposed to do public management at the moment. It has a name, New Public Management, and it has a set of foundational beliefs and a set of foundational frameworks and kind of practices that enact those. So it's a kind of mutually supportive thing. So change, like the start of change is the dissonance that people feel where people doing the work, so anyone with any kind of public management responsibility, so anyone with any responsibility for planning and organizing how public service works, public service in the broadest possible sense, they feel what we found is that people feel a sense of dissonance with that the organizing story that New Public Management tells. So you've got a group of, you find people saying, I outsource the things you told me to outsource. I'm measuring the things you told me to measure. I'm performance managing the things that you told me to performance manage. It's still not working. I cannot make the experiences of the service that I manage, or the things that I commission, or the residents that we work with. I can't make those experiences make sense with that story anymore. And so what that dissonance becomes the energy for change, because it is that sense of, I can't make my life make sense with the existing story of this stuff makes it anymore. That creates the possibility for change. And you can't talk someone into that. You can't evidence someone into paradigm shift, because the nature of paradigms means that people ask different questions and they interpret evidence differently. Right? But what you can do is you can find out who else is experiencing that sense of dissonance, that dissatisfaction with how things are doing. You can draw on evidence to help validate their sense of dissatisfaction. So there's an absolute ton of evidence out there that says that new public management doesn't work. So kind of a big research report from 2015 saying that whole approach to outsourcing and target-based makes government more expensive and creates more complaints. Right? Tons and tons of research reports about kind of outcome-based performance management, pretty much all saying the same thing. They create gaming. Like the highest possible evidence standards of systematic reviews of target-based performance management, 80% of those studies find evidence of gaming, and nearly 3/4 find evidence of people deliberately lying, manipulating data in target-based performance management things. So we can combine the existing evidence to help kind of validate people's sense that there's something fundamentally wrong with this, and use the kind of the human learning system's alternative narrative as ways to go, does this help you make sense of what it is that you're experiencing? That fundamental sense of wrongness that you experience about how stuff works, does this help to make sense? And then what we found people do is that whatever constituency of people who are feeling that sense of wrongness in their context, they gather themselves together and they create the largest permission space they can to experiment with something different. Because the answer to how do you start doing this is about experimentation. Right? So it is about creating an experiment where the purpose of the experiment is to find out how you're going to do public management differently in that context. And you can create the permission space to do that experiment on your own, because everyone has the capacity to make some choices about how they do their work, right? Well, almost everyone. But the more people you can gather together to create a permission space to do an experiment, the larger that permission space for the experiment is. So the one in the report, I think it's chapter 9, we give a list of the different types of roles that we found useful to be part of that first kind of permission space. If you've got someone like this and someone like this and someone like this and someone like this involved in that permission space, it will make it much easier for you. The other thing I would say about this is the experiments seem to go much easier if you get the money involved. So somewhere along the line, pretty early in the thing, to really make a difference, you're going to have to involve those who fund or commission or otherwise resource the work that you're talking about. Because unless you can get the money to behave differently, then it is exceptionally harder. It makes it much harder to do anything else. So those are the things that I think we've learned about how you start with this. I'm curious to then know what other people's experiences of trying to create those permission spaces for experiments are. Well, and how does that response kind of land with different people who are asking the question about how do we start?
Helen Simmons, I can see you want to come in. Please
yes,
do.
I'm not very good with silences, and so I can try to answer from my perspective. I'm really lucky to have been working in what I would think of as a permission space as part of a project that ran for my master's degree. So I work at part of a student team at Northumbria University, and we've been a part of the multidisciplinary innovation course. So we ran a 9-week experiment to pull together a constellation of organisations in the field of social justice. So it was prison groups, mental health charities, police forces, housing associations, homelessness charities, into a space where we just created space for opportunity, for discussion, to build up that empathy. And it feels like, from reading about human learning systems very recently, that that's really the start of what we're trying to create there. And I think we were lucky to have that academic framework of, come along, help these students to do a bit of a research project, and let's see what comes out of the end of it. What's frustrating for me is that unless I manage to navigate my way to stay involved, my part of that is now finished. But all the signs are that people have found it really positive and powerful, and that they all want to continue working together, hopefully to move along this journey. But from my perspective, one of the reasons I wanted to join this session was because my assignment is all about what happens next. We've all come together, we've all got to know each other, we all agree that the system doesn't work, we all want to do something about it. Literally, what do we do next as a group? Thank you.
Thank you. Any other takers, or Toby, do you want to respond to that? I'm nearly there in terms of organising our themes.
Yeah, any other responses that people make? Otherwise, I'll pick up kind of Greg Spencer's point from the chat. Okay, so the thing that Greg's point in the chat about what can you do when people are kind of wedded to KPIs and that kind of stuff is, in some respects, that is an exceptionally difficult set of conditions to try this stuff out in, and you might be reduced to a kind of small scale permission space skunk works type experiment, but those are still really valuable to do if you can get those right. But one one tactic that I think is worth trying if you've got kind of boards or other senior leaders who are wedded to KPIs is to turn round the concept of accountability on them. So present them with the evidence about how KPIs are create more expensive, less effective services, because the evidence is everywhere on that stuff. And if you need some help kind of tracking down the kind of academic peer review, like top quality things, there's a ton of it there. I can help with that, and get them to sign off and saying, like, okay, here's so when you're starting off some new kind of project or program, say and they're insisting on organizing it in a kind of new public management way, get them to actually sign off. I am saying that this must be done like this despite the evidence on it. Because, and the reason, and if you can make it less confrontational by saying, oh, you know, previous evaluations of this work kind of stuff always say that that there was a problem because of the KPIs and blah blah blah. So we just, when the evaluators ask again why we were doing like that, can I tell them that you said that we had to? Right? Let's make accountability do its work. Right? Let's actually make people accountable for choosing the public management paradigm that they choose.
Yeah, I think the biggest challenge I've just seen recently is an entire culture where they genuinely believe that all the information pathways to the board should be through the CEO, and just think you can't build a learning system like that. You know, it just doesn't work. Yeah, really tough.
And so, like, the thing that if people genuinely believe that, they should be happy to sign off on it. Right?
It's the damage they do before it all unravels that's the worry there.
Yeah. By the way, you will hear the mischievous tone in my voice when I was talking about that. Like, you would want to you would want to be very secure in your position before you took that particular piece of advice. But like, we have, I think it is a perfectly reasonable tactic to say, because it is using the kind of key concepts of new public management and saying, okay, let's hold this. Let's make them do the work that they're supposed to do. Right? If the senior people really are getting paid the big bucks to make the difficult decisions, then let's hold them accountable for that. Because we're saying the biggest decision that you make is what public management paradigm are you going to choose to do the work. And as soon as we recognize it as a choice that it can be made, then we are held accountable for our choices, right? The best place to look for that evidence. So we'll add the evidence. So there's a section on the Human Learning Systems website about evidence around new public management. We'll kind of add a bunch of things to that, and there's a bunch of the references in the first and kind of last chapters of the new report has a bunch of that links to all the evidence about that stuff.
So Toby, I'm pleased to report I've done some organising. I'm less pleased to report that it's taken me till halfway through our call to do some organising. I'm wondering actually whether a quick scan of those themes might be as productive as trying to do votes on them, because I think you can probably cover multiple topics through sort of single answers. So just to read them back to people, we've got the question around how do we start? We've got a set of questions that I've interpreted as being, we're not starting from nowhere, we're starting from somewhere. So how do we cope with that, given that people have roles and responsibilities and pressures? A set of questions that are around how do we shift perspectives and maintain hope and momentum. Some that are about tools and methods, both how this links to other disciplines, but also, you know, tools and methods that maybe are bespoke to HLS. We've got something about the legitimacy of helping from the outside, and what have we learned about if you're not part of the system, what does it take to help the system? Examples of success, examples of failures and common mistakes, and then there's a couple of specific questions about specific systems. So if everyone's comfortable with it, my suggestion would be maybe just to let you, Toby, pick from those ones that you think take us somewhere most productive.
Yeah, okay, so maybe I'll pick up some of the kind of starting from where we are questions, and also it kind of connects to the examples of success, because one of the nice things about operating within a new public management framework that cannot work effectively in complex environments is that it's constantly having to try and reinvent itself in order to try and put fingers in the dikes of the constant failing that is happening in different positions, in different places. So there are like in the contexts in which you work, there will be reviews of why did that last thing that we tried didn't work, right? There will be change programs come in that go, oh, we need to try and think about how we do things differently, and blah, 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 blah. There will be, sometimes those are kind of allied to funding opportunities. So recently, we've seen the kind of government's Changing Futures program, for example, or a few years back, the big lottery funds, like system change things. There, around the corner, there is always an opportunity to bring people together to try something different. It is kind of my experience of that. So what I would encourage people to think about is, in your context, what do those opportunities look like? Where are they likely to come from? What's the big thing that failed that that everyone's worried about? Who are the people that you serve that, and I hate this language, but I can't think of a better shortcut right now. So you will often hear public servants talk about frequent flyers, right? The people that are making use of public services in multiple different ways, and who from that lens are quite expensive, right? When you start examining any of the what public service needs to do around them, then you get into the space that we're talking about really quickly, because they are complex problems, they are wicked problems, they are multidimensional problems, they're problems that change all the time. There are, like, people who are prepared to get into the how do we tackle that really expensive stuff, there are opportunities all over for saying, actually, part of the problem is the way we've done this before. So in terms of starting where we are, that's what I would say. What are the opportunities to kind of highlight the dissonance within the particular contexts in which you work? So if I kind of just offer that as a kind of provocation, what are people's different responses to that?
No rules here, folks. So please just come off mute and start speaking if you've got something to say. Robin.
Well, certainly in the field that I've been mainly working in the last few years, which is homelessness, roof leaping and so on, the pandemic produced such a panic within government. Hello, Toby seems to be waving. I'm not quite sure what that...
Sorry, I was trying to support that particular point, Robin.
Okay. There are all kinds of conventions about different jazz hands meaning different things, and I'm not quite sure I keep keeping up. But the pandemic produced a panic in government that meant that they not only threw a certain amount of money at frontline services, giving them enormous freedom, but they also undid a lot of the micromanagement in contract setting. And right across the board, I hear from one review after another that was extraordinarily effective. In other words, the evidence of what happened in the last year or so was that as soon as you abandon that stuff, you get extraordinary results out of people and out of services. I have to say, the impression I have is that over the last few months, there's a kind of weariness and exhaustion creeping in. So I don't want to present this as too much of a sort of solution. This is where all the exciting thing is happening at the moment. But it does seem to me that there's an enormous amount of recognition that once you abandon all that stuff and just get people doing the best they can do infinitely better, far more cost effective and so on. So that's been my experience, my impression.
Any other thoughts, folks?
So Toby, maybe I'll just chuck a challenge in for you because it links to one of the other questions that I think has been raised is to what extent is starting from where people may be at a problem and leaves you trapped by the status quo or complicit with the status quo?
I mean, my kind of response to that is, what choice do we have? Like, you can't. Did actually once stop for directions driving around the city, and the person who said, we were asking said, "Oh, if I were you, I wouldn't start from here." It's like, thanks very much. That's the least helpful directions I'm going to receive today. So, what else are you going to do but start from where people are? No? There are kind of tactics that I think can use around this. So like there are like leverage points where at least in people's imagination there are the practices and beliefs of key actors in the system can really kind of change things. So the way that commissioners commission is absolutely one. So find the dissatisfied commissioners and help them work through some of this stuff is a really kind of, if you're trying to tactically think about like helping people shift from where they are, find the dissatisfied commissioners. Similarly to at the point about regulators, find the dissatisfied regulators. And because we've been, one of the things we've been doing at CPI is in partnership with Andy and Lankelly Chase, we've been hosting a community practice for regulators and the regulated who want to try and do things differently, who want to create kind of learning environments. So, and what we found for that is that there's a ton of dissatisfied regulators with who recognize that if regulation is going to do the thing that it really needs to, then part of what they need to be creating is learning. Is they're asking the question, what do we need to do as regulators in order to create effective learning systems? We don't know the answer to that, but that's the right, like, experimenting with that question, that's the right thing to do, right? And so there are similarly another, and to pick up the point about grassroots organizations, one of the things that a piece of work that Lang Kelly Chase have been supporting in Gateshead is that trying to support Gateshead to become a kind of learning system as a whole place. And so very kind of simple and quick piece of work. Andy Crosby from the Collective Impact Agency interviewed a bunch of people from grassroots organizations and public service bodies and blah, 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 just asked the question, how do you learn? And it did like maybe 30 interviews across different people in the kind of broadly kind of people and social care space in Gateshead. And the biggest theme from what we got back was people saying, we don't learn. Learning is a luxury for us. And when that finding was presented back to the kind of key senior leaders in Gateshead, we got, hang on a minute, the people doing the work with some of the most vulnerable, marginalized people in the borough, they say that learning is a luxury. Oh my God. And then began to unpick what, say, the role of commissioning was in creating that situation, blah, blah, blah. That created a bunch of momentum for change, right? And so you got the chief executive of the council saying, like, do you know what, we in public, we hold up our hands. It's partly been the way that the council has commissioned, that has created this situation of learning has been a luxury. What is it that we can do differently, right? So there are, even from situations of apparently little power in any given system, by laying the nonsense of how stuff happens at the moment, laying the consequences of that bare to people, can shock people into thinking about it differently.
I'll just add a comment on that, which relates to that. I think my experience at the moment, this is purely personal opinion, but working in local governments, you know, the pressure on people at all levels in the organisation is so high at the moment. It's very, very hard to get anyone to give any attention to doing anything different. And it's kind of the easy thing to do is to not ask questions, to accept that data. That data says the performance is good. Don't ask any questions. We can put that on one side. We don't need to think about it. And I guess the thing that might challenge that does take time. You know, if you can actually sort of look at some of the, you know, the more qualitative sort of feedback, I suppose, from people using those services, you might get a different story. But somehow, I suppose, we need to find somebody who can take that time to look at that, maybe tell some stories, some case studies and that kind of thing, that then enables people to see where things perhaps could be done better. And I'm sure everyone kind of recognises when they've got the time to think about it, that there's huge inefficiencies in the way we work, duplications and all sorts of time wasted filling in boxes. But yeah, it's a question of how do we sort of try and make that space. And the pressure now seems to be greater than ever after 10 years of austerity, you know, stripping out that capacity for management of organisations, and then obviously COVID on top of that.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point, that recognising that asking questions then requires a bunch of hard work and hard thinking and like personal change as well as kind of organisational change, because the easy thing in all of this is to blame someone else, and this, whatever it is that's going wrong because of them, right? Actually, when this stuff really changes is when people go, oh yeah, this stuff is going wrong because of the way that I've been acting, amongst a bunch of other things. The one kind of note of like optimism I would kind of offer, Simon, in relation to that is weirdly, and you'd never have wanted this because kind of austerity kills people, but one of the weird side effects of austerity and the pressure on budgets it creates is it creates the space to bring in the evidence that says new public management is massively wasteful and expensive. And so if we want, there is an option here to improve how things work and save money. And now we're starting, there are little bits and pieces of evidence now that we've got to say, look, this, if you try it like this, like a bunch of stuff gets better for people and we save a bunch of cash. And I've yet to meet a kind of local government or NHS person yet that isn't interested in saving some cash somewhere.
Yeah, and I think there has been a sort of a recognition of the importance of communities, and partly forced, admittedly, but a recognition that actually we need to be thinking about how we can help people to support each other and support themselves and so on, rather than thinking that we can do everything, fix everything ourselves. And maybe that does open a door to thinking and drawing on some of the more creative approaches that might be in the voluntary sector as well.
So Toby, just building on that and with one eye on our clock, there were questions in there about examples of success, but also kind of the failure modes or common mistakes. I wonder, you've mentioned the note of optimism. So can you point us towards examples, evidence, and can you also maybe just bring to life for us, where does this go wrong or falter?
So, I mean, for all of the, for example stuff, I would encourage people to check out the Human Learning Systems case studies page. So the website's humanlearning.systems. Like within that, under the resources section, there's now kind of 49, I think, case study examples. So in each one of those is written up in a way that tries to tell the story of change that people have gone through and the stuff that they've found hard and the stuff that has worked for them. So I would point people in the direction of all of that stuff. And it's even max searchable now, so you can put in keywords and stuff like that, or look, and it's on a map, so you can see the things that are closest to you in the country. It's all Andy Brogan's doing, so it's very nice. In terms of failure modes, it's an interesting pattern. So not getting the money involved is one thing I would classically say. So people who try and create learning cultures on top of or alongside existing kind of funding and performance management stuff, and it just doesn't work. If you're trying to generally create that kind of learning environment, then you have to change how the money works. The other kind of failure mode that sometimes see around this is, it's funnily enough, the flip side, trying to force through doing things differently without doing the dirty, mucky work of actually enabling people to have conversations with each other and tell the hard truths and the annoying things. So I'll tell you, give you the example of Liverpool Combined Authority, which is one of the case studies. And I've heard them tell this story in public, so I don't think that they would mind me telling it. Homelessness commissioners in the Liverpool Combined Authority decided they wanted to do take an HLS approach to commissioning the assertive outreach programs that they were creating in the Liverpool Combined Authority area. So said to the suppliers, we want to do commissioning differently. We want to move to a kind of trust-based commissioning environment. And the excuse me 1 second.
That's complexity at work right there. Unpredictability. That's an arranged live example for us.
Sorry, trying to negotiate with daughter about leaving and coming and going and blah, 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 blah. Oh yeah, Liverpool Combined Authority. We want to do a trust-based commissioning approach, and there was so little trust in the system up at that point that the providers turned around and went, "We don't believe you." So we want to move to a trust-based system, but there isn't enough trust to make that switch. Ah, excellent catch 22, right? So I remember the phone call I took from Katie involved in it, which was like, now what are we going to do? And interestingly, the way that they addressed that particular problem was, so they started from what can we change? What can we change? How can we signal that we're going to do this differently? And so they changed their contract management meetings, which had previously been, are you meeting this number? Are you meeting this number? Are you meeting this number? Into shared sense making things. Okay, what data have we got? Let's put it all on the table. Let's together understand what that means. So turning those contract management meetings into learning environments, which was something entirely in their gift, helped to build that sense of trust.
Thanks, Toby. So Toby, again, I've got one eye on the clock. We've only got about 5 minutes left, folks. So please do jump in with any questions that are lingering for you, or indeed any comments that are lingering for you that you think are important to make. While you think about that or do that, Toby, anything else on that mural board that you want to jump into?
I see Paul's come off mute.
Yeah. Go on, Paul.
Yeah, no, it's just a quick response really to one of Greg's comments in the chat, just around you know, how do you avoid sort of blaming people who you don't see are kind of, you know, on the journey with you. And you know, it just reminded me of the work I was involved in before the pandemic. We ran a project in Oxfordshire, and we had Michael Little from Ratio, who's something you might know, as our learning partner. And a common refrain of his was that you know, bad systems make people do bad things, although his language was slightly more colourful than that. And which is just a reminder that, you know, everyone is sort of trapped in this paradigm, and you know, whether you are really motivated to try and do something about it or not, you know, it's going to continue to drive bad outcomes, and I guess it's just about taking the time to notice that and recognise it.
Yeah, I think that's really important, Paul, that kind of moving up, like taking that sense that all behavior is communication, right? People who have been being disruptive and you might perceive as awkward and all that previously, are they communicating to you in some respects their dissatisfaction at being forced to do what they kind of know is nonsense? And so like there is some of the most successful examples of this that we've seen have started by taking the people who were most previously thought of as most awkward in the previous way of doing things and giving them some space to try something different.
Couple of notes in the chat box. So I've got Greg and Sarah. Greg, yours is sort of in response to that discussion. Do you want to comment on it?
Yeah, I just think with every one of these things, it's always a balancing act, and you catalyze things, and you're just treading a fine line, aren't you? You want to keep, you know, you want to meet people. There's that meeting people where they are actually just locks you into the past. But then if you try and presume to be the all-seeing one who can actually see where people will want to be, then you start becoming the arrogant, high-handed, and dismissing people. There isn't a middle ground between those. You've just got to keep pushing one and reverting to the other. And I think too much of the danger is pretending there's a third way, and there isn't. You're either meeting people where you are, or you're actually pushing things. It's a bit like the problem with the Me Too movement and things like that. You know, consent isn't simple. It isn't a black and white yes or no, and there isn't a sort of middle ground fuzzy bit. You only find the boundaries by crossing them, and if you cross them repeatedly, you're going to get it right sometimes and wrong sometimes, and that messiness can't be taken out of the system. And I think that's where I find the most resistance to getting started. I had a call the other week where they're talking about a 5-year plan and how do they get started. And I think it was, they wanted a way of getting started where they didn't have that messiness in the middle. They didn't have to keep getting things wrong. And I couldn't see a way of getting started without making shed loads of mistakes where you just upset people and just then go and say sorry.
Thank you, Greg. Yeah, perfection is the enemy of doing anything in the context of something that's deeply imperfect. It's pretty weird, isn't it? Toby, sorry, we're running out of time, but I'm keen to give you a chance to answer Zara's question there. So I don't know if you can see it in the chat box, but she's keen to develop more understanding of the approach in a pragmatic way.
Yeah, so our attempt to bring together all the knowledge from all the different places of people who are trying this, because the only stuff we know about human learning systems is gathered from like people who do this work coming together to reflect on it. So that's the only things we know about it are from conversations and kind of action research around that work. And the place where we have gathered all of that together is the Human Learning Systems website, so humanlearning.systems. You will also on there find a link to a Knowledge Hub forum where people kind of asking each other live questions. Knowledge Hub's a bit clunky as a thing, but it's the best that we've got. But also an organization called Collaborate are helping people to develop different communities, learning communities, kind of communities of practice around human learning systems in the UK right now. And again, links to that, those kind of community of practice, those learning community things can be found from that Human Learning Systems website. There's a little kind of, would you like to be involved type form that if you fill in, goes to appropriate people who should get in touch with you.
Thanks, Toby. And that link, I can't lay my hands on it right now, but I will, as long as people are happy with this, email out that link following today. So if you haven't been able to find your way to it, you'll find it easily in the email. Toby, everyone, we've hit 2 o'clock, which is our allotted time. So I'm sorry to be drawing us to a close. It feels for sure like one of these things we could spend all afternoon exploring and still have more to do. But just say a huge thanks, first of all, to you, Toby, for being prepared to put aside some time to do this. But also to everyone for coming along, showing an interest, taking part, asking questions, sharing your thoughts. It's always fun to do these things. We do one monthly with different guest speakers. So next month, I can't actually remember. We've got, I think it's Owen Lewis from Sport Wales, who's talking about how he's trying to apply these sorts of ideas in practice. If you'd like to come and join us, you'll find the details at nextstageradicals.net/events. So I think for today, that's probably it. Thank you so much for joining us and have a good weekend.